I've got a root cellar standing empty, and you've got a winter coming. Take it. Snow on the cellar steps. 200 jars set in rows, none of them hers, all of them labeled in a hand she did not know. Malinda Fletcher was 34 years old, the preacher's unmarried daughter, and Hollow Creek had already said the word out loud to her face at the mercantile counter. Too old now, past courting. She had no money of her own, no husband, and a father whose health was going the way of the last warm week in October. If she lost the town's good opinion, she lost her roof with it. So why would a man who had barely spoken 20 words to her in 6 years fill a cellar for her and never once say his name to the postmistress? Tell me where you're listening from tonight. I like knowing who is sitting with her. Stay with this one. It moves slowly, and it earns every inch. 3 months before the snow, on the second Sunday of September, at 11:15 in the morning, Malinda Fletcher stood at the back of her father's church and counted the hymnals. There were 41 of them. There had been 44 in the spring. She wrote the number in the margin of the attendance book the way she had written it every month for 11 years, and she did not let herself think about where the other 3 had gone, because the answer was that people took things when they stopped believing you would notice. Her father was in the pulpit. He got through the reading, and then he stopped in the middle of the second verse and had to find his place again with one finger, and the pause went on for perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds is nothing. 4 seconds in a room of 60 people who have known a man for 2 decades is a long time. Malinda felt the room adjust around him, the small kind shifting of shoulders, and she looked down at the attendance book and kept her face exactly as it was. That was the first thing she was carrying that morning. There would be more before noon. After the service, the congregation gathered under the cottonwoods, the way it always did, and the women sorted themselves by rank without anyone saying a word about it. Married at the center, widowed near the steps where the shade was best, and Malinda at the edge holding the coffee pot because she was the one they handed the coffee pot to. Mrs. Orpha Deakins found her there. Mrs. Deakins was 60-some years old, kind in the way a hard frost is thorough, and she had made a small career of saying the plain thing out loud so that no one else had to. She looked Malinda over. She asked after the Reverend's chest, and she said the Bickford boy had come back from Fargo with a wife, and then she said what she had come to say. You'd have had him at 20, Malinda, but a man that age wants children and years, and you've spent yours on your father. It's a credit to you. It's just too late now, that's all. No cruelty in it, no hesitation either. Malinda said, "More coffee, Mrs. Deakins," and poured it, and her hand did not shake, and inside her chest something folded itself smaller to make room. She was 34 years old. She wanted you to understand that she had heard some version of that sentence 8 or 9 times by then, always gently, always in public, always with the coffee pot in her hands. That is the particular arithmetic of a small town. They do not throw a woman out. They simply move her an inch a year from the middle of the picture to the edge of it, and they tell her it is a compliment. Now, what none of them knew, and what I want you to hold on to, is this. Malinda Fletcher had spent her girlhood in her grandfather's apiary, 31 hives on a slope in Ohio, and she had learned there to read a sky the way other people read print. She knew what it meant when the bees came home heavy at 2 in the afternoon and refused to go out again. She knew the smell of air that had changed its mind. Her grandfather used to hold the almanac up and shake it and say, "This thing guesses," and you know. She had believed him. Nobody in Hollow Creek had ever asked her. And at 17, she had been sent to a seminary for young ladies in Virginia, French and pianoforte and deportment, and the seminary closed its doors the same week her tuition ran out, which she always thought was the closest thing to a joke God had ever told her directly. She came home with 3 trunks and no certificate, and had been useful ever since. Useful is not the same as wanted. She had worked that out sometime around her 29th year on a Tuesday alone in the kitchen, and she had not said it to anyone since. Monday she went to the mercantile with 90 cents and a list she had already cut twice. The mercantile counter in Hollow Creek was where the town made its decisions and pretended it was only buying flour. Percival Ingersoll was there, as he generally was, in a coat too good for the weather, running the only freight line in the county that advertised in the paper. He had opinions about the grain cooperative, and he shared them at a volume that let the whole room in. He was pleasant. That was the thing about the man, and I will not pretend otherwise. He held the door for women and remembered children's names, and he could ruin a person over 2 weeks of casual sentences without once raising his voice. He greeted her warmly. He asked after her father's health, and when she said he was resting well, Ingersoll said, of course, and then said to the room, and no one to help her with the man either, shame there's no arrangement to be made for a woman like Miss Fletcher. But then that door does close. 2 men laughed, not unkindly. That is worse. Malinda counted out her coins on the counter. Flour, salt, about a paper of pins. She put the coffee back on the shelf herself so that no one would see the total change. The postmistress, Dessa Rowe, watched her do it from behind the sorting window and said nothing, and slid a newspaper across without charge, and said, "Take it. It's 4 days old. Nobody wants it." That was the whole kindness available to her that day, and Malinda took it, and was grateful, and hated being grateful. She walked home the long way. The long way went past the cooperative's grain sheds, where a dozen men were loading wagons in a hurry, and she stopped at the fence rail because the light on the west edge of the sky was a color she recognized from her grandfather's slope. That was where she first stood, near Carson Kilgore, for longer than 11 seconds. He was 44 years old, weathered, bearded, hat on, one glove off, checking a knot on the third wagon. In 6 years, he had said perhaps 20 words to her in total, and she had counted them, which tells you something she would not have admitted. He belonged to the cooperative the way any rancher did, 1 member among 40. There were parts of his life she had only seen the edges of, and she had not thought yet to wonder why the freight rates in that county had stayed low for 3 straight seasons. He looked at the sky she was looking at. He did not speak. Then he said, without turning, "You've got a bag splitting." She looked down. The flour sack had opened along the bottom seam and was leaving a thin white line back the way she had come. He came over. He took the sack out of her arms before she could arrange her face, tipped it, held the split closed with one hand, and walked it to the loading bench. He cut a length of grain sacking off a roll that was not his to cut, folded it, doubled the flour inside it, and tied the whole thing with twine in a knot she did not know how to make. He handed it back. He said, "That'll hold to your gate." She said, "Thank you." She said she would return the sacking. He said, "No need," and put his glove back on. That was the extent of it. No question about her father. No comment on the missing coffee, though he had been at the mercantile counter and he had certainly seen. No pity in his face at all, which was the part she thought about later, lying awake, because pity was the currency everyone else in Hollow Creek paid her in, and she had gotten so used to the taste of it that plain help felt like a foreign language. Another small thing she noticed, walking away. He had cut that sacking without looking at the price mark, and no one had told him he could. She got home. Her father was asleep in the chair with the Bible closed on his knee. She set the flour on the table, still wrapped in another man's cloth, and she stood in the kitchen with her coat on for a while, listening to the wind change direction. Early, she thought. It's turning early this year. There was no one in the house awake to tell. Bread money in a town like Hollow Creek worked like this. Almost nobody had coin. The men settled up at the mercantile counter twice a year against the crop, and in between the whole county ran on a column of figures in somebody else's book. A woman who wanted money of her own, actual money, in her hand, had 3 ways to get it: eggs, butter, or something baked, set on the shelf by the door with a card in front of it, sold to the men who came in off the roads with a nickel loose in their coat. Malinda Fletcher had no cow and 11 hens, 4 of which had stopped laying. So on the last Saturday of September, she carried 6 loaves to the mercantile in a basket with a cloth over it, and asked, in the smallest voice she had used in years, whether she might set them on the shelf. 5 cents each. The shelf was free. Everyone knew the shelf was free. She asked anyway because asking is the tax you pay when you are the woman they hand the coffee pot to. The shelf was by the door where the cold came in. Her card said, bread 5 cents, in her own careful seminary hand, the one thing that place had given her that ever came to use. She stayed to arrange them and then could not make herself leave, and that is how she happened to be standing at the pin drawer, pretending to need pins she could not buy, when Carson Kilgore came in with his hat on and 3 wagons waiting outside. He looked at the shelf. He looked at the card. He said, "I'll take the lot." The clerk asked, did he mean the 6? He said, the 6. He paid in coin, 30 cents, counted out of a worn pouch, and he set the coins on the counter rather than in the clerk's hand, which Malinda would think about later, and he loaded all 6 loaves into a flour sack and went out to his wagons and was gone before she got her breath in order. 30 cents. I want you to sit with how small that is, because she did. 30 cents does not change a life. It bought a tin of her father's tincture at the mercantile with 11 cents left over, and she walked home with the 11 cents in her glove so she could feel it there. Another small thing she noticed that first Saturday. The whole county ran on credit, and a man with 3 wagons and 40 head could have said, "Put it on my book," and nobody would have blinked. He paid coin. Coin left no line in anyone's ledger. Coin left nothing for anyone at that counter to read out loud later. She did not understand yet why that mattered. She noticed it the way you notice a stone in your shoe before you know it is a stone. The next Saturday she baked 8. She was awake at 3:30 to do it because the stove had to be fed slow to keep an even heat, and the parsonage stove had a cracked plate on the left side that ran hot. 8 loaves is not baking. 8 loaves is freight. Her arms ached from the second rising, and there was flour set into the creases of her knuckles that would not come out for 2 days. He took all 8, 40 cents on the counter. The clerk, who was young and meant nothing by it, said, "You must have a lot of mouths out there, Mr. Kilgore." He said, 9 hands and a cook that can't bake. That was the sentence. She turned it over all the way home. 9 hands and a cook that can't bake. It was reasonable. It was so reasonable that it explained everything and closed the subject. And Malinda, who had spent 11 years reading the small shifts in a congregation's shoulders, recognized a sentence built to close a subject when she heard one. The third Saturday she wrapped the loaves in the grain sacking. She had washed it twice and hemmed the cut edge because the cut edge frayed, and because a hemmed edge was a thing she could give back that was better than what she got. It made a good breadcloth. It held heat, and it did not stick. He saw it on the shelf. He stopped for perhaps 2 seconds with his hand halfway out. He said nothing at all about it. He took the 10 loaves, paid 50 cents, and as he lifted the bundle, the cloth came away, and she reached for it at the same moment he did. Their fingers almost touched. Almost. He drew his hand back first and let her have the cloth, and he waited, hat on, while she folded it into quarters and put it in the empty basket, and then he carried the bread out bare-armed against his coat. Another small thing she noticed. He had waited. A man in a hurry with 3 wagons on the road had stood still in a cold doorway for as long as it took a woman to fold a piece of sacking into quarters, and had not once looked out the window at his teams. Now let me tell you about Thursdays, because the Saturdays were the money and the Thursdays were the thing that actually undid her. The cooperative's hauls went out Thursday. The road they took to the north sheds ran past the parsonage gate, close enough that Malinda could hear a loaded wagon coming for a quarter mile and tell you by the sound how heavy it was. The parsonage pump stood 20 feet from that gate, and the pump handle had gone stiff in August. Her father could not work it. She could, with both hands and her weight behind it, and it took her about 40 pulls to fill the barrel, and she did it Tuesdays and Fridays and did not mention it to anyone, because who would she have mentioned it to? The second Thursday in October, she came out with the barrel already full. Not partly full, full to the rim, and the ground around it wet, and the kindling box on the step packed and squared with the split ends all turned one way. She stood there in her coat with her hands empty. He never came to the door, not once, all that autumn. The wagon slowed at her gate and stopped, and there was the sound of the pump and the sound of an axe going for perhaps 6 minutes, and then the wagon moved off toward the sheds, and she would come out to a full barrel and a full box. Some Thursdays she stayed inside on purpose to see if he would knock. He did not knock. Some Thursdays she went out and stood at the corner of the house where he could see her plainly, and he touched his hat brim and kept working, and when he was done, he said something short about the weather or the road, and got back up on the wagon. No questions, no pity, just the barrel full and the wood cut. Her father, who missed almost nothing even when he could not hold his place in a verse, said one evening, "That Kilgore boy has water in my barrel again." Malinda said the cooperative men were being kind to the church, and her father looked at the fire a while and said, She set a cup of coffee on the step the following Thursday. He drank it standing, hat on, one boot on the bottom stair, in about the time it takes to say a psalm. He handed the cup back empty and said, "That's better coffee than I make." She said, "It's the same coffee everyone has." He said, "No." Then he got up on the wagon and went, and Malinda stood in the yard holding a warm cup in the cold, with her heart doing something she had absolutely no intention of naming, and if you have ever been the useful one in a house for 11 years, you know exactly what that "no" did to her. She set the coffee out every Thursday after that. She also set out a chair. He never sat in it. All autumn, a plain kitchen chair on the porch, boards with a folded blanket over the back, and every Thursday he stood, and every Thursday she brought the chair in at dusk and dusted it off and put it back out the next week. I could tell you she stopped hoping. She did not stop putting out the chair. Meanwhile, across town, Percival Ingersoll was busy being pleasant. Here is what he was doing, in figures, because figures are the only honest way to tell it. In August, his printed rate to haul a ton of wheat to the railhead at Cutbank was $1.40. In the first week of October, he mailed out a circular that made it $1.10. By the first week of November, it was 85 cents. Dessa Rowe stamped every one of those circulars and mailed them to every farm on the route. And she said to Malinda across the sorting window, in the flat voice she used for things she had decided to notice, "He sends one every Monday. Same hour. Same envelope. He must love the sound of the stamp." Malinda asked, "Can a man haul grain for 85 cents? Dessa said, "Not, and eat." At the counter, Ingersoll told the room that the cooperative was a charming idea run by amateurs, and that when it folded, and it would fold, he would carry their grain anyway, out of neighborliness. He said it kindly. He always said it kindly. He asked after Reverend Fletcher's chest every single time, and he never once got the name of the tincture wrong. And once, in the second week of November, with 3 men at the stove, he looked at the empty bread shelf and said, "Miss Fletcher, I hear Kilgore buys your bread by the armload. A man ought to be careful. Charity gets talked about." Malinda said, "It isn't charity, Mr. Ingersoll. He pays me." Ingersoll smiled and said, "Of course he does." 2 men laughed. She has told me that she went out and stood in the alley behind the mercantile for about 30 seconds, and then she straightened her cuffs and walked home and baked 12 loaves for the next Saturday instead of 10, which is, I think, the closest that woman ever came to violence. Now the weather. The last week of October, the geese went over Hollow Creek 9 days earlier than she had ever recorded them, and they went high and did not circle. The willows by the creek dropped their leaves green. On the 28th, the air came around out of the northwest at about 4 in the afternoon, and it had that smell in it, dry and metal, that her grandfather used to call the air changing its mind. She wrote it all in the back of the attendance book, where she wrote the hymnal count. Nobody had ever asked her for the front of that book, let alone the back. That Thursday she said it out loud at the gate to a man standing on the second stair with a cup of coffee because he was there and because he had never once looked at her with pity in his face. She said, "The hay you have cut. I'd move it under cover a week early." He looked at her, really looked, in a way that made her want to go inside. He said, "Why?" She said, "The geese went high on the 19th. The willows dropped green. And the wind came around at 4 instead of sundown, 3 days running." He drank the rest of the coffee. He said, "Where did you learn that?" And she told him, 31 hives on a slope in Ohio, her grandfather's, and how you knew by the weight of the bees coming home at 2 in the afternoon whether the season had turned, and how the old man used to hold the almanac up and shake it and say, "This thing guesses, and you know." She talked for perhaps 90 seconds, which was more consecutive words than she had spoken to any man in that county in a year, and then she stopped, mortified, and said, "It's only bees." Carson Kilgore set the cup down on the rail. He said, "I'll move the hay." He moved the hay. She found that out the following Monday from the clerk, who mentioned that Kilgore had pulled 9 men off fencing and run hay under the pole barn for 2 days straight, and nobody knew why. And there had been talk that he had gone soft in the head, and then on the 8th of November it snowed 4 inches and froze hard on top, and every uncovered stack in that valley took water. Nobody connected it to her. Nobody ever would have. Malinda sat in her kitchen with the attendance book open at the back page and felt, for the first time in about 5 years, like a person who knew something. Another small thing she noticed in the middle of all that. A man had rearranged 60 tons of hay and the labor of 9 hands on the word of a preacher's daughter, and he had not asked her to prove it, and he had not told a single soul where the word came from. He let them think he had gone soft in the head instead. The snow came for good in the 3rd week of November, and the ritual did not stop. It only got harder to do, which is how you find out what a ritual actually is. He came Thursdays through 6 inches of it. The barrel iced at the rim, and he broke the ice with the axe handle before he filled it. She kept the coffee on the back of the stove so it would still be hot when the wagon sound came, and she learned the sound so well she could have the cup poured before he reached the gate, and she never once let him see that she had it poured before he reached the gate. He said, "On the 20th, you don't have to come out in this." She said, "Neither do you." He said, "Well," that was the whole exchange. She thought about it for 2 days. By the end of the month, there was $4.55 in a tobacco tin behind the flour crock, all of it in coin, and every coin of it had come out of the same worn pouch. She counted it on the last night of November with the door shut. It bought her father's tincture through the winter. It bought lamp oil. It meant that when Mrs. Orpha Deakins asked, kindly, in front of 4 women, how they were managing, Malinda could say, "We're managing," and have it be true, and I would like you to understand what it is worth to a woman to be able to say that sentence and mean it. The last Saturday before Advent, 12 loaves went on the shelf, wrapped in hemmed grain sacking. He took the lot, 60 cents. And on his way out, with the bundle against his coat, and the door open, and the cold coming in around him, he stopped and said the longest thing he had said to her in 6 years. He said, "There's a social at the Grange Hall, Christmas. They'll want your bread." Then he said, "And they ought to want more than that." And he was out the door before she could arrange her face, which by then she had stopped trying to do. Here is how a freight war actually works in a county with 1 railhead. Every ton of wheat has to get to Cutbank. The cooperative hauled its members' grain with its own wagons at cost, and cost in that country, in that winter, was somewhere near 80 cents a ton. Percival Ingersoll's circular of the second Monday in December set his rate at 70 cents. Dessa Rowe stamped it and mailed it to every farm on the route, and then said, across the sorting window, in the voice she kept for things she had decided to notice, "He isn't hauling for 70. He's paying 10 cents a ton for the pleasure of it." Malinda asked how long a man could do that. Dessa said, "Long enough. That's the whole idea." The men at the mercantile stove did the arithmetic out loud and came out grateful. Cheaper is cheaper. 11 farms signed with Ingersoll's line before Advent was out, and every one of them was a man who had stood in the cooperative shed in September and called it his own. That is not villainy. That is a family with a coal bill. But it left 40 members carrying the freight for the whole valley, and it left one of them, though nobody was saying so, carrying rather more than a 40th. And then the talk turned, the way talk does, from the money to the woman. It began gently. It always begins gently. Mrs. Orpha Deakins asked Malinda, in front of 4 women under the church steps, whether the Reverend had been able to afford his tincture this winter, and when Malinda said they were managing, Mrs. Deakins said, "Yes. We noticed you were managing. We noticed." 2 words and the whole shape of it. By the second week of December, the shape had a sentence attached. A man does not buy 12 loaves of bread for 9 hands. A man does not fill a widow's barrel. And Malinda Fletcher, who had been too old to be wanted since roughly her 30th year, was now in the same mouths something else entirely. Not a spinster, not a burden, a woman being kept. Ingersoll never said it. I want to be exact about that, because his gift was precision. What he said, at the counter, kindly, with his hat in his hand, was this: "The cooperative is short of cash, and yet one of its members finds coin for bread every Saturday. I only wonder where a rancher gets loose coin in December." Then he asked after the Reverend's chest and got the name of the tincture right. 3 men laughed. Malinda understood, standing at the pin drawer with nothing in her hand, that the laugh was not about her at all. She was the crowbar. Discredit the bread, and you discredit the man who bought it. And a cooperative whose quiet backer looks like a fool is a cooperative that folds by spring. So she did the only thing available to her, and it cost her more than anything else in this story. On the 3rd Saturday in December, she did not bake. The shelf by the door was empty. She stood in her kitchen at 3:30 in the morning with the stove cold and her hands clean, and she let it be empty. And she cried about it exactly once, for about 40 seconds, and then washed her face. On the Thursday, she brought in the chair. She took the blanket off the back and folded it and put it in the chest, and she carried the chair inside, and she did not set the coffee on the back of the stove. She heard the wagon coming for a quarter mile the way she always had, heavy, slower in the drifts. She heard it stop. She heard the pump handle and the axe for perhaps 6 minutes. She stood behind the door with both hands flat against it, and did not go out. The wagon moved off. The barrel was full. The kindling box was packed and squared with the split ends all turned one way, the way it had been every Thursday since October, and on the top of the wood, where the snow would not reach it, was the tin cup, upside down, empty, set there so it would not fill with weather. She brought it in and washed it and put it on the shelf. He came the next Thursday and the one after and did the work and drank nothing, and she stayed behind the door, and the distance between them widened by exactly the length of a porch. There was no way to explain it to him that would not have made it worse. That is the part I find hardest to say plainly. She was protecting a man standing in a town by starving the one thing in her life that had ever fed her, and he could not be told, because a man who was told would have come to the door, and a man who came to the door would have proved every sentence Ingersoll had not quite said. The Grange Hall social was 11 days off. A norther in that country did not arrive. It was delivered, and the road to the railhead at Cutbank ran 14 miles, and 2 of those miles ran through a cut between 2 low hills where the snow laid in every year and stayed. Once the cut filled, nothing moved. Not a wagon, not a sled, not a man on a good horse. The cooperative's last haul of the season was set for the 23rd of December, after the social, because that was the way the schedule had always been written, and a schedule in a small place is a kind of scripture. On the 16th, Malinda Fletcher went out to the barrel and found the ice had formed in rings toward the center instead of the rim. That was the first thing. Then the smoke off the parsonage chimney lay down flat and slid toward the ground instead of climbing. Then 2 sundogs at about 9 in the morning, pale and set wide. Then the hens, who would not come out at all, and the creek fog at dawn standing still in the willows instead of drifting east. Her grandfather had a rule about that, about air that stops moving before it moves hard, and she wrote all of it in the back of the attendance book in her seminary hand. 30 hours, she thought, 40 at the outside. She sat with the book on her knees for a long time, because here is what it cost. She had bought a man's good name in that town with 3 weeks of an empty bread shelf and a chair carried indoors. And to tell him this, she would have to walk to the cooperative sheds in daylight, in front of whoever was standing in them, and be seen speaking to Carson Kilgore on purpose. She put on her coat. The sheds were a mile and a little more. There were perhaps a dozen men inside out of the wind, and Percival Ingersoll was among them with his hat in his hands, because he went where the men were. Malinda came in with the cold, and every head turned, and she did not wait, because waiting would have finished her. She said, "The road will shut inside 2 days. You want to haul tonight?" A man by the stove said the almanac had it clear through Christmas. Ingersoll smiled. He said gently, kindly, in the voice he used for children and for women he intended to bury, "Miss Fletcher watches the geese. I've heard. It's charming. My line hauls on the 23rd as printed, gentlemen. Steady rates, steady schedules." 2 men laughed. She stood there with her hands folded and let them. Then Carson Kilgore said, from the back of the shed, "How long have we got?" She said, 30 hours. Maybe less. He said, "Load tonight." Somebody started to argue about the teams and the dark and the feed, and he said, "Load tonight," again in exactly the same voice, and that was the end of it. And Malinda understood something she had not let herself understand in 6 years of counting his words. Nobody in that shed asked him who had made him the one who decided. She walked home. She did not stay to watch. They went past the parsonage gate all night, wagon after wagon, and she lay in the dark and counted them by sound the way she had learned to, heavy, slow, the harness ringing. She had 22 counted before she slept. The storm came in on the 18th at about 11 in the morning and blew for 31 hours. By the end of it, the cut was drifted 9 feet deep, and the road to Cut Bank was shut for 9 days. The cooperative's wheat was already on the platform at the railhead, all of it, 40 farms worth, sold and weighed and paid. The wheat of the 11 farms that had signed with Ingersoll's line at 70 cents a ton sat in sheds in Hollow Creek with a schedule printed on paper that said the 23rd. I am not going to dress that up. A woman who had been told to her face that she was past use had just put the whole valley's winter on a train. Nobody said so yet. Stay with it. Thursday came, and she heard no wagon because there was no road to bring one. What she heard, at about 4 in the afternoon with the light going blue, was a knock. He had never once come to the door. All autumn, the pump and the axe and the tin cup, and never the door. She opened it, and he was standing there with ice in his beard and his hat white, and a sled behind him and a horse blown to the skin, and he said, "Road's shut behind me. I can't get back tonight." She said, "Come in." He stood on the mat and would not move until she took his coat, and her father woke in the chair and looked at him a while and said, "Sit down, son," and Carson Kilgore sat. She brought the kitchen chair over to the stove. She got the folded blanket out of the chest, where it had been since the 3rd Saturday in December, and she put it over the back of the chair, and he took it off the back and put it across his knees, without a word about any of it, and she went and stood at the counter and had to hold the edge of it for a moment. He had brought coal on that sled, kerosene, a side of bacon, a bag of oats for hens he had never seen, not a ribbon, not a speech. Just wait on a sled. At about 2 in the morning her father was asleep, and the wind had come back up, and they were both awake at the stove, and Malinda said the thing she had promised herself she would never say. She said, "I stopped baking because Mr. Ingersoll was using me to make you look a fool. A man who buys 12 loaves and fills a barrel. I thought if there was nothing to see, they would leave you alone." He turned the cup in his hands and said, "I know. I counted the shelf empty 3 Saturdays. She said, "I'm 34 years old, and this town has already decided what I am. I've no money. I've a father to bury one day and no trade but a stove. All I have is a stove and a way of looking at the sky," she said. He set the cup down. He said, "I know what you have. I've known 6 years. That was all. No promise. No hand across the table." He looked at the stove door and said, "I ought to see to the horse," and went out into it, and Malinda sat in her own kitchen at 2 in the morning with her hands in her lap and understood that a man had been standing at her gate since October, saying one sentence at a time. The Grange Hall social went ahead on the 22nd, because a road being shut to Cut Bank is not the same as a road being shut to town. They came in on sleds and on foot with lanterns. There were, by her count, 71 people in that hall, which was more than had been in her father's church at any time since spring, and I will let you make of that what you like. She brought bread, 14 loaves, wrapped in hemmed grain sacking. Here is the part I want to lay down carefully, because it was done with paper and not with fists. Dessa Rowe was the postmistress, which meant that every circular mailed in that county passed under her stamp, and that the post office kept a file copy of anything printed and mailed in bulk. She had been keeping them since August, not out of suspicion, out of the habit of a woman who files things. She came to the long table where the men were talking freight, and she laid the file down and opened it flat and read the figures out in the voice she used for postage. August the 4th. $1.40 a ton to Cut Bank. October the 6th. $1.10. November the 3rd. 85 cents. December the 8th. 70 cents. Same envelope. Same hour. Same press. Then she read the last line off the December sheet, the one they had all had in their hands and none of them had read twice. Steady rates, steady schedules, hauling on the 23rd as printed. Somebody said the cooperative's cost was 80 cents. Dessa said, 81 and a fraction. It's in their book. Mr. Kilgore's clerk will show you. Nobody accused Percival Ingersoll of anything. That is the whole point. The numbers sat there on the table in his own type, 4 sheets in a row, and any man in that hall could see that a line cannot carry grain at 70 cents when it costs 81, not unless it is paying to do it, and that a man does not pay to do a thing unless he means to be the only one left doing it. And the schedule said the 23rd. And the 11 farms who had signed for the cheaper rate had their entire crop sitting in sheds a mile from where they stood, on the wrong side of 9 feet of snow. Ingersoll was by the door with his hat in his hands. He had come to be pleasant. He started to say that the almanac had it clear through Christmas. Then he stopped and looked at Malinda Fletcher, who was standing at the end of the table with a breadcloth folded over her arm. And I think that was the first time in his life the man actually saw her, not as the preacher's daughter, not as the crowbar, but as a woman who had read the rings of ice in a rain barrel and been right when his printing press was wrong. He said, "Miss Fletcher, I," and did not finish it. He put his hat on and went out. Nobody went after him. Nobody said a word about him for the rest of that evening, and that in a town like Hollow Creek is the entire sentence. He kept his line. He kept his coat. He hauled through the spring, and men were civil to him at the counter and asked after his family and did not ask him about the weather, and when he offered an opinion at the stove, they let it lie there, and by March he had stopped offering them. He was not run out. He was simply no longer listened to. Malinda was asked, twice that night, whether the cooperative ought to leave the 11 farms to sit. She said, "Their wheat is in the sheds, the same as anybody's. Haul it." Carson had it hauled in April at cost. Every farm, including 2 men who had laughed in that shed in September. Now watch what the town did, because it did it slowly, which is the only way it ever means anything. Young Bickford's wife came and asked her, shy about it, whether the plum trees would be safe to prune in the last week of March. The clerk from the mercantile asked her when to expect the creek up. Old Halvor Pettit, who had never spoken to her in his life, took his hat off and asked what the fog standing still in the willows meant, and wrote her answer on the back of a seed envelope. By February, there were 4 men and 9 women coming to the parsonage kitchen door for the season, and she kept the back of the attendance book open on the table where anyone could look at it. And Mrs. Orpha Deakins, who was 60-some years old and had never in her life said the word sorry out loud, came across the Grange Hall floor, took the coffee pot out of Melinda's hands, and said, "Sit down, girl. Somebody else can pour." Malinda sat. At the end of the evening, Carson Kilgore came and stood in front of her with his hat on, and he said it the way he said everything, plain, with the door open behind him and the cold coming in around his coat. "I've got a root cellar standing empty," he said, "and you've got a winter coming. Take it." She went out with him, and there was snow on the cellar steps, and 200 jars stood in rows in the lamplight, every one labeled in a hand she did not know. 200 jars, and she stood there with the lamp in her hand and asked whose writing that was. "His mother's," he said. "She died 11 years back. I've put up nothing since. Cellar's been full and no one to eat out of it. So it was not charity, and it was not a purchase. It was a room in his life that had been standing cold with the door shut, and he had come to a woman the town had set at the edge of the picture and asked her, in the only language he had, to use it. She took a jar down. Plums, dated in September, in a hand that had loved somebody. She put it back exactly where it had been. She used that cellar all winter. She walked the mile and a little more twice a week for it, and she brought her father through February on another woman's plums and her own bread, and she never once carried anything home without leaving something in its place. Hemmed sacking, folded, a loaf. A jar of her own, labeled at last in her own careful seminary hand, set at the end of the row where his mother's writing stopped. Then the creek came up in the last week of March, on the day she had told Halvor Pettit it would, and the plum trees were pruned safe, and the willows leafed out green and stayed green. On a Thursday in April, Carson Kilgore came to the parsonage door. He had come to the door all winter by then, and he had learned to sit in the kitchen chair without being told twice. He put the cellar key on the table, not handed, sat down, the way he set coins on a counter so nobody could say later that anything had been slipped past. He said, "That's yours now, however this goes, whether you have me or you don't." And then he took his hat off in her kitchen, which she had never seen him do, and he put it on his knee and asked her. She did not say yes right away. She said, "I'm 34 years old." He said, "I'm 44, and I've known for 6 years, and I'd have waited 6 more. I'd rather not." She put her hand out across the table, and he took it, and that was all. And it was more than a kiss would have been, because she had spent 11 years handing things to people, and had never once had her hand held on purpose. They were married in her father's church in May. He got through the whole reading without losing his place, which she counted a mercy, and wrote in the back of the attendance book, along with the wind and the count of hymnals, which was 44 again by then, because people bring things back when they think you will notice. There were 71 people at the wedding. She noticed the number. Of course she did. And when they sat down after, at the long table under the cottonwoods, Carson Kilgore pulled out her chair. The plain kitchen chair, carried up from the parsonage porch, the one he had never sat in all autumn. He set it at his right hand and held it while she sat, and then he looked at her and he smiled. He had smiled maybe twice in the 6 years she had been counting. This one he gave whole, and only to her. When I think about them, I do not think about the storm, or the ledger, or the man by the door who could not finish his sentence. I think about a cellar full of somebody else's jars, and one jar at the end of the row in a new hand. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you're listening from and what moment touched you most. If you spent this whole story quietly rooting for her, drop a comment and tell me, did she get everything she deserved, or is there something you still wanted for her? I read all of them. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. If you'd like more quiet evenings by the fire, lonely roads, quiet cowboys, and hearts finding their way home, come back for the next one. Thank you for watching until the very end. I will see you in the next one.